He ran a timber operation for 22 years without keeping a single written record, and by the time Vera Calloway arrived on a Tuesday in November, the sawmill was 3 months from collapse. He just didn't know it yet. I've come across stories like this before. Stories about men who built something real and solid with their hands, and then quietly let it rot from the inside, because they confused stubbornness with strength. But the story of Silas Drummond and what happened in the autumn of 1897 is the one I keep returning to. Not because it ends well, though it does, but because of what it cost to get there. Silas Drummond was 41 years old when his older brother Clement died. Clement had owned a quarter stake in the Drummond Mill, a working sawmill on the eastern edge of the Cascades in central Oregon, sitting on a stretch of old-growth timber that their father had claimed before either of them was born. The mill employed 14 men, it ran 6 days a week. It cut board lumber for homesteaders and railroad contractors from the valley all the way up through the high country. Silas had run it alone since he was 19. First alongside his father, then after his father's heart gave out, alone. Clement had moved south to Sacramento and married a woman named Patricia and made his living buying and selling dry goods. He sent letters twice a year. He never came back to see the mill, but the quarter stake remained his, recorded in their father's will, and when Clement died of a fever in September of 1897, that stake passed to his daughter. Her name was Vera Calloway. She was 34 years old, a widow, and she had been keeping the books for her late husband's freight business in Sacramento for 6 years before he died. She arrived at the mill on a gray Tuesday morning, in a wagon she had driven herself from the train station in Prineville. She had one trunk, a leather satchel, and a composition notebook that she kept tucked under her arm like a physician keeps a medical bag. Silas watched her pull the wagon into the yard from the window of the foreman's office, and his first thought, the one he would later admit to though not for some time, was, what could she possibly know about any of this? He went outside to meet her. He did not send anyone else. You're Silas, she said. It was not a question. That's right, he said. She looked at the mill. She looked at the timber stacks along the east fence. She looked at the crew shed and the drying barn and the equipment shed where the secondary saw was stored, and then she looked back at him. I'd like to see the accounts, she said. He told her the accounts were in order. She said that was good to hear, and that she'd like to see them anyway. That first evening, Silas showed her to the small house at the edge of the property that had been his mother's house before it became a storage room, and then, cleared out over the past 2 weeks in grudging preparation for her arrival, a guest house. He had swept the floors himself. He had put a lamp on the table. He had not told any of the crew he'd done these things. She thanked him for the house and asked if she could have access to the ledger books that evening. He said they were in the office and she was welcome to look at them in the morning. She said she'd prefer that evening if it was all the same to him. It was not all the same to him, but he brought them anyway. 3 ledger books, 2 years of supply records, and a folder of contracts with the rail company. He set them on the table in her house without a word and walked back across the yard in the dark. He told himself she'd look at them for an hour, understand nothing, and go to bed. He told himself that by the end of the week she'd sell him the quarter stake and go back to Sacramento where she belonged. He told himself a great many things that turned out to be wrong. Vera did not go to bed that evening. She lit 2 lamps and sat at the table, with the ledger books spread open and her composition notebook beside them, and she worked. She had a system. She'd had it for years, since her first year keeping books for the freight business, where she moved through accounts in a particular order, checking the supply costs against the output figures, then checking both against the contract revenues, then looking for the places where the numbers didn't hold. She found the first problem before 9 o'clock. The mill was paying for lumber dressing from a supplier named Pratt & Sons out of Portland, at a rate that had been negotiated in 1891, but she found 2 invoices, buried in the second ledger book, dated 1895, where the rate had been quietly raised by 11% with no notation, no letter, no signed amendment. The higher rate had simply appeared and every invoice since had reflected it, and from what she could tell, no one had noticed. She wrote it in her notebook. She kept reading. By 10 o'clock she had found the second problem. The mill's contract with the Oregon Central Railroad ran through December of 1898, but the volume commitment in the contract, the minimum board feet per quarter that the mill was obligated to deliver, was higher than the mill's current production capacity by about 15%. She checked the numbers 3 times. They held each time. The mill had been under-delivering against the contract for at least 18 months, which meant the railroad had the legal right to apply a penalty clause, which meant, and she pulled the contract out and read the penalty language very carefully, that the railroad could be owed somewhere between $400 and $600 in outstanding penalties, and if they chose to invoke that clause before renewal, the mill would not survive the settlement. She sat with that for a while, then she wrote it in her notebook and kept reading. She worked until past midnight. By the time she closed the last ledger book and set her pen down, she had found 5 problems: the Pratt & Sons rate, the railroad penalty clause, A wage discrepancy in the crew records that suggested someone had been paid for days they didn't work. Not enough to be certain theft, but enough to require looking into. A gap in the timber inventory records from the spring of 1896 that didn't correspond to any sale or any recorded spoilage. And the drying barn, which according to the insurance certificate filed in 1893, had been assessed at a value that bore no relationship to its current condition, and which, if there were a fire, would be dramatically underinsured. She did not feel triumphant. She felt tired, and she felt something that was closer to sorry than to satisfaction. Sorry that Clement had never known. Sorry that no one had been watching. Sorry that a man who clearly loved this place had been quietly walking toward a cliff for years, without realizing the ground was changing under him. She went to bed near 1 in the morning. She left the lamps burning low. Silas came into the yard at 5:30 the next morning, the way he always did, and he saw the light still going in her window and something moved in his chest that he did not name. He did not knock on her door. He went to the equipment shed and began his morning check of the primary saw. And he was halfway through his inspection when he heard the door of the house open and her boots on the gravel. She looked like someone who had slept 3 hours and was not particularly bothered by it. "I need to talk to you," she said. "Breakfast first," he said. "Silas." She said his name the way a school teacher says a student's name when the student is about to make a mistake. "I need to talk to you now." He set down the oil rag he'd been holding. He looked at her, and something in her face, not alarm, not accusation, but something serious and steady, made him follow her back to the house. She showed him the notebook. She didn't read it to him. She set it open on the table and pointed at each item in turn and told him, plainly and without drama, what she had found. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. He looked at the notebook. He looked at the ledger book still spread across the table. He looked at the window, then back at the notebook. "The Pratt & Sons rate," he said finally. "I noticed it went up. I thought it was a standard adjustment." "It wasn't standard," she said. "It wasn't agreed upon. You've been paying it for 2 years. More silence. "The railroad contract," he said. "Yes, how much time do we have?" "The contract renews in December of next year," she said. "If they choose to enforce the penalty before then, and if they choose the high end of the clause, the mill cannot pay it and remain solvent. If they choose not to enforce it, which they may not if the relationship has been otherwise good, you have 14 months to bring production up to the committed volume or renegotiate the terms." He was quiet again. He had a way of being quiet that was not passive. It was the quiet of a man working something through, weighing it carefully, turning it like a piece of timber to check the grain. "You found all of this," he said, "in one night." "I found the shape of it," she said. "Some of it will need more time to confirm. And the wage records. Someone has been paid for days they didn't work. I don't know who yet. I wanted to ask you before I looked further." He stood up from the table and walked to the window. Outside, the crew was starting to arrive. He could hear boots on the gravel, the creak of the equipment shed door, someone calling out across the yard. "My father kept these accounts for 30 years, he said, not to her particularly. "I've kept them for 22. No one's ever." He stopped. She waited. "No one ever told me there was a problem," he said. "No one knew," she said. "Or if they knew, they didn't say. That happens." He turned back from the window. He was not a man who asked for help easily. She could see that in every line of him, the set of his jaw, the way he stood, the careful economy of his movements. He had built his whole life on not needing to ask, but he was also not a fool. "What do you need from me?" he said. She told him. She needed 3 things. She needed access to every piece of paper in the office, invoices, contracts, letters, receipts going back 10 years. She needed to speak privately with each of the 14 crew members, one at a time before the end of the week. And she needed Silas to fire Pratt & Sons. He looked at her when she said that last part. "Pratt & Sons has supplied this mill for 11 years, he said. "And for the last 2 of those 11 years they've been overcharging you without authorization," she said. "You can give them the opportunity to credit the difference. If they do, you can consider continuing the relationship. If they don't, you already know what kind of business they are." He was quiet again. Then he said, "That will cause disruption. I'll need a new supplier before I can cut them loose. I know 3 freight suppliers in Portland who work with lumber operations," she said. "I can write to them today if you'd like." He looked at her for a long moment. It was not a hostile look. It was the look of a man recalibrating, adjusting his sense of what the next few weeks were going to look like. "Write the letters," he said. What followed was the strangest and most productive 2 weeks of Silas Drummond's professional life. Vera set up her working space in the far corner of the office. She didn't ask for the desk. She took the side table near the window, and she worked her way through 10 years of paper the way a surgeon works through a procedure. Methodically, without hurry, without wasted motion. She did not make assumptions. She did not guess. When she found something she wasn't certain about, she set it aside and came back to it rather than deciding prematurely. On Thursday of the first week she spoke to the crew. She did it in the equipment shed, one man at a time, with the door open so no one felt cornered. She did not interrogate them. She asked questions about the work, about the supplies, about whether anything had felt off to them in the past year or two. Most of the men were cautious at first. They were not accustomed to being asked, and they were not certain what her presence at the mill meant for them. By the third interview she had a name. A man named Elton Ferris had been on the crew for 4 years. He was a decent worker by all accounts, quiet, reliable, showed up on time. But the third man Vera spoke with, without being directly asked, mentioned that Elton sometimes signed the roster for days he'd spent in Prineville. He said it as though it were a small thing. It was not a small thing. Silas confronted Elton that afternoon. Not in anger, he didn't have the kind of temper that broke into anger easily, but directly and without cushion. Elton admitted it. He'd done it 11 times over the past 18 months. He said he needed the money. He said he was sorry. Silas let him finish. Then he told him to collect his tools. That evening, for the first time, Silas brought 2 cups of coffee to the house at the edge of the property and knocked on the door. Vera answered. She had ink on her right hand and her hair was coming loose from where she'd pinned it. She looked at the 2 cups. "Come in," she said. He sat in the chair across the table from her stack of ledger books, and she sat in the other chair, and they drank their coffee in a quiet that was different from the quiet that had been between them on that first morning. This was not the quiet of 2 peoples deciding what they were going to be to each other. It was the quiet of 2 people who had, without planning it, already become something to each other. Partners in a problem, colleagues in a crisis, and were only just noticing. "Elton's gone," he said. "I heard you were right about the roster." She didn't say anything to that. She didn't need to. "I've been running this place the same way since I was 19 years old," he said after a while. "Same suppliers, same contracts, same way of keeping accounts. My father's way. I didn't see any reason to change it." "It worked for a long time," she said. "But it stopped working," he said. "Things do," she said. "It doesn't mean the original way was wrong. It just means things changed and the system didn't." He looked at his coffee. "How do you know when to change the system?" She thought about it honestly. "When the numbers tell you to," she said. "The numbers don't lie. They don't have loyalty to the old way. They just say what's true." He looked at her. Not the way he'd looked at her the first morning, when he was trying to determine what she knew. He looked at her the way you look at someone when you realize they've been right about several things and you want to understand how. "Do you want to stay?" he said. She set her coffee down. "What do you mean?" "Past the end of the month," he said. "What I'm asking is whether you'd consider staying on, to manage the accounts, properly. I can't pay you what you'd make in Sacramento, but—" "You don't know what I made in Sacramento," she said. "No," he said. "I don't." She looked out the window for a moment. It had gotten dark while they were talking. The lamp in the window threw a rectangle of yellow light onto the gravel of the yard. "Let me finish what I started," she said. "Then we'll talk about what comes next." He nodded. He took his coffee cup and stood up from the chair. "Silas," she said. He turned. "The railroad contract," she said. "I think we should write to them before the renewal date, not to negotiate yet. Just to establish goodwill. Show them you're aware of the volume discrepancy and that you're working to address it. It's better to be the one who brings it up." He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he said, "Draft the letter. I'll look at it in the morning." He walked back across the yard in the dark. She drafted the letter that night. The response from the Oregon Central Railroad came 6 weeks later. The district manager, a man named Horace Biggs who had been overseeing the rail contracts in the region for 12 years, wrote back to say that he appreciated the correspondence, that the railroad had in fact been aware of the shortfall, but had chosen not to invoke the penalty clause given the mill's long relationship with the railroad, and that he would be glad to sit down and discuss revised volume commitments before the December renewal date. Silas read the letter twice. Then he walked across the yard to the house at the edge of the property and knocked on the door. Vera answered. She read the letter. She did not say "I told you so," because that was not the kind of person she was. What she said was, "That's a good letter. Biggs is reasonable. The meeting will go well." "Come with me," Silas said. She looked up from the letter. "To the meeting," he said, "in December. I'd like you there." She looked at him for a long moment. There was something happening between them that neither of them had named yet. Something that had been building since that first evening when he brought the ledger books across the yard in the dark. Something that had grown quietly in the space between 2 people working hard on a problem they both cared about. She recognized it. She was not afraid of it, but she was careful. "I'll be there," she said. The meeting with Horace Biggs took place on the 4th of December in the railroad's district office in Prineville. Silas came in his good coat, which was not a very good coat but was the best he owned. Vera came in a gray wool dress that she'd pressed the night before at the boarding house where they'd stayed, on opposite ends of the hall, without comment from either of them. Biggs was a compact man with a gray mustache and reading spectacles that he kept folding and unfolding as he talked. He was not unfriendly. He looked at both of them across the conference table and did not seem particularly surprised that a woman was present, which Silas noticed and filed away without comment. Vera had prepared a document, 3 pages, handwritten in her careful clear script, that laid out the mill's current production capacity. the improvements that had been made in the past 6 weeks, and a proposed revised volume commitment that was achievable given the current equipment and crew size. She had also included a one-page summary of the rate discrepancy with Pratt & Sons, which the mill had by then formally disputed, and the new supply arrangement that had been put in place with a Portland firm called Alderman Lumber Goods, which had come in 11% lower than Pratt's fraudulent rate. Biggs read the document. He folded his spectacles. He looked at Vera. "You prepared this?" he said. "I did," she said. "You manage the accounts for the Drummond operation?" "I do." He looked at Silas and Silas met his eyes without expression. There was a version of this moment Silas knew, where he felt the need to explain her, or to qualify her role, or to say something that would smooth over the irregularity of a woman sitting at this table presenting financial documents. He did not do any of those things. "The revised volume looks achievable to me," Biggs said. "If the production capacity holds." He looked at Vera again. "You're confident in these figures?" "I checked them 3 times, she said. "They hold." Biggs refolded his spectacles. He looked at the document again, then he said, "All right, let's talk about the new contract." They were out of the office by noon. The new contract ran 2 years, with a volume commitment that the mill could meet, a penalty clause that had been substantially revised in the mill's favor, and a first delivery date in January that gave them 4 weeks to prepare. The Pratt & Sons dispute had been noted in the file as evidence of good faith accounting practices. Silas and Vera walked out of the railroad office into the cold December air, and he stopped on the steps. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him. "I mean it," he said. "I know what I had before you got here and I know what I have now." "You had a good mill," she said. "You still have a good mill, you just know what it's doing now." "That's not a small difference," he said. "No," she said. "It isn't." They stood there on the steps for a moment in the cold and the town went on around them. Wagons in the street, a dog barking somewhere, the smell of wood smoke from the building across the way, and Silas Drummond, who had not asked for help from anyone in more than 20 years, looked at Vera Calloway and said, "I don't want you to go back to Sacramento." She looked at him for a long time. The wind came up the street and moved a loose strand of hair across her face and she didn't push it away. "I know," she said. "Is that an answer?" he said. "It's the beginning of one," she said. She stayed. Not immediately in the way he might have hoped, and not in the way a story sometimes simplifies for the sake of a clean ending. She stayed at the mill through the winter, and in January she took on the full management of the accounts on a formal basis, with a wage that they'd negotiated over 2 evenings at the table in her house. Her house now, in the way that a place becomes yours when you've worked in it and worried in it and made it habitable by your own effort. The mill met its first delivery under the new contract on the 14th of January. It met every delivery that followed. In the spring, Silas had the drying barn assessed and properly insured. He took out a small loan at Vera's suggestion to upgrade the secondary saw. The old one had been running at reduced capacity for 3 years, and no one had said anything because the primary saw had always compensated. When both saws were running at full capacity, production went up by nearly 20%. By April they were running ahead of the contract commitment for the first time in 2 years. There is a moment in most good partnerships, the quiet kind, the ones built on something real, where the 2 people involved stop negotiating and simply move, where they stop talking around the thing between them and start moving with it instead. That moment came for Silas and Vera on a Saturday morning in May, when she showed him the spring production numbers, and he looked at them and looked at her and said, "You should have some stake in this." She set down her pen. "What do you mean?" He meant exactly what he said. He had spoken to a lawyer in Prineville. Her father's quarter stake had reverted to the mill's general holdings when she hadn't claimed it formally. A technicality he hadn't told her about, because he hadn't wanted to create a reason for her to leave. He wasn't proud of that. He told her so. She looked at him for a long time. "How long have you known?" she said. "Since February," he said, more quiet, the kind that could have gone several ways. "I want to make it right," he said. "You can have the quarter stake back, or we can do something else. Whatever you think is fair." She thought about it. She was a woman who thought things through before she spoke, and she thought this through carefully. Then she said, "Something else." In June of 1898, Vera Calloway became a full partner in the Drummond mill. Not a quarter stake but a third, drawn up in a proper legal document that Silas paid for and she reviewed twice before signing. Their names were both on the mill's contracts from that point forward. When they wrote to Horace Biggs at the railroad to notify him of the change in partnership, Biggs wrote back with a single line, "It seems the operation is in good hands." They were married the following autumn, on a Saturday in October, in a small ceremony at the church in Prineville. 14 men from the mill came. Horace Biggs sent a letter. The lawyer who had drawn up the partnership agreement was the witness. The mill ran for another 31 years. When Silas died in 1929, the operation passed to the 2 children he and Vera had raised. A daughter named May who had inherited her mother's gift for numbers, and a son named Curtis who had her father's feel for timber and his mother's refusal to accept a figure that didn't add up. Under their management, the mill survived the depression by a margin that the bank called extraordinary and that, May, when asked, attributed entirely to good accounts. Vera outlived Silas by 9 years. She kept the books until she was 72. When she handed them to May with the same composition notebook she'd brought to Oregon in the fall of 1897, filled now and refilled and filled again over 31 years of careful watching. She had never stopped watching. There's a version of this story where Silas is the hero, where a good man held onto something his father built and fought to keep it, and that version is true. But it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is that what he'd built was quietly coming undone, and he didn't know it, and someone had to come and show him what was real. The part that takes something out of a person, that costs something, was not finding the problems. Vera found those in one night. The hard part was Silas choosing to look. Choosing to hear a woman he'd just met tell him that everything he thought was fine was not fine, and deciding to believe her instead of his own long certainty. I think about that choice a lot. The choice to let someone else's clear eyes correct your own blind ones. What is the thing in your life that you've been running the same way for too long, that you know, somewhere under all the habit and the pride, needs someone to come in and tell you the truth about? Tell me in the comments. I'd genuinely like to know.